The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening. Welcome to tonight's discussion titled MIPS 2020 Introduction to Promoting Interoperability. My name is Brett Paepke. I'm the Director of Eye Care Professional Services with Revolution EHR. Very happy to have you here. What a perfect lead into tonight's democratic debate, talking about another government topic like the merit-based incentive payment system. The good news is we aren't going to dive too deep into the entire system. We're just going to focus on one category tonight, and that category is going to be the one that grades us on our use of Revolution EHR. That's promoting interoperability. So our goals here are going to be fourfold. We want to review how the MIPS scoring system works and modifies reimbursements, just to provide that background information to anybody who may be new to the topic. We want to discuss the promoting interoperability category of MIPS. We want to highlight how promoting interoperability is scored. And then we want to define each measure within promoting interoperability and how it's tracked within Revolution. So the hope is we leave this discussion with a better understanding of the workflows that are required to see the numerators and denominators trigger for the few numerical measures that we need to pay attention to. So with respect to that background information, remember the reason we talk about this so much is because MIPS is what's going to modify your reimbursements for Medicare Part B services in the future. There's no longer a formula that's going to modify all doctors' reimbursements by the same amount each year. Now, how you are paid in a given year is based on your performance in MIPS. Now, your performance is graded on a scale of 0 to 100 based on how you do across these 4 performance categories, or these slices of the pie that you're seeing over here on the right. Each slice contributes a certain percentage to your overall score. We're going to be focusing on this one in blue here tonight, worth 25%. But again, how you do in each adds up to a score on a scale of 0 to 100. The higher that score, the better, because ultimately your score is compared to Medicare's score, known as the performance threshold. If your score happens to be higher than that performance threshold, you will see your reimbursements going up 2 years later. If it is lower, then you'll see your reimbursements going down 2 years later. And the farther away you are in either direction, the more significant the upward or downward revision would be. Now, when we talk about the magnitude of that change, in 2022, the amount that your reimbursements could change could be up to 9% in either direction. Now, those of you who've been with merit-based incentive payment system for a while or paid attention to this topic, you may remember back in 2017, the potential was only about 4% in either direction. Now we're up to 9%. And some of you still may look at that and say, well, 9% based on what I know I do in Medicare revenue isn't all that much. The burden of participation may outweigh any potential upward reimbursement revision. I'm not going to do this. Conversely, some of you may look at that and say, well, I definitely want to be paid the most I can for the services that I'm providing. So this is something I definitely want to do. Regardless of your choice or the direction you go, the hope of these types of presentations is that we can put you in a position to make a better educated decision for your practice based on what you know your goals are. If we try to illustrate those ideas, you have the range of scores here on the bottom, going from 0 on the far left to 100 on the far right. That comparative value, okay, the one that Medicare sets, is set at 45 this year. In our hypothetical example, Dr. Smith scored 77. So her 77 is the sum of points that she received across those 4 performance categories that we talked about. Because 77 is higher than 45, she will see her reimbursements increasing in the year 2022. The actual amount that she will see it go up will depend on the performance of everybody else participating in the program. Okay, the worse everybody else does, the greater the potential for Dr. Smith. There's also bonus money out there. Medicare sets aside $500 million over the first 6 years of the program to reward those doctors who do exceptionally well. In 2020, exceptionally well is defined as a score of 85 or above. So in our example here, Dr. Smith didn't exceed the additional performance threshold. So while she'll see her reimbursements go up by being above the standard performance threshold, she's not entitled to additional bonus payments because she didn't exceed that. Those bonus payments can range up anywhere from a 0.5% up to 10% more. So the ideal scenario is achieving a score of 85 or above. Now, it's hard to ignore the fact, though, that the merit-based incentive payment system is getting harder. If we look at the relative performance threshold and bonus threshold over time, we can see that these are getting harder. The performance threshold, that comparative value, was set really low in the first year. That was due in large part to the fact that Medicare released the specifics of the program very late in 2016, and it didn't give us a whole lot of time to understand what needed to be done. But they were very clear that the expectations on us were going to be ramped up pretty quickly over time. We can see that being true here in 2020, where it is now 45. We'll see it going to 60 next year. And then after that, it's become the average or the median score of all doctors participating in MIPS. Over to the side of that, you can see the same thing being true for the bonus threshold. That's gone up. But along with that comes the increased potential reimbursement revision. So the perspective of this we choose to take is that increasing thresholds don't necessarily need to be a bad thing. I know we would tend to look at those and say, man, the requirements are getting harder. How am I going to keep up with this stuff? But keep in mind that increasing thresholds increase the opportunity for increased reimbursements in the future. Remember, it's a comparative program. You are compared to how everyone else does in the program. So as the requirements get more challenging for everybody else, it really stands to benefit those people who understand what needs to be done and execute on truly what needs to be done. So again, let's focus on this specific category tonight. We'll go through the requirements. We'll talk about some of the specific ideas here so that we're better prepared to understand, some of the things that we may be seeing on the scorecard. We'll also talk about that scorecard specifically and where you can find it and what it shows you. This promoting interoperability category, that term may seem new to some of you, but really it is a revised version of meaningful use. It's a much more friendly version of it, many would say. It is no longer called meaningful use. It is no longer called advancing care information. Over time, Medicare has taken a number of the objectives and measures out to focus on just those things that make it easier for providers to share information with each other, their patients, and their patient families. So when we look across the included measures and objectives, you'll see there's only 4 objectives now: e-prescribing, health information exchange, provider to patient exchange, and public health and clinical data registry reporting. That's it. You can see the measures associated to those objectives running down the middle here. We'll talk about each of these tonight. And then over to the far right, you will see the maximum number of points that are available for that particular measure. Your performance in Revolution EHR determines how many of these points you get. So if we're looking at e-prescribing, for example, let's say 90% of the prescriptions you write are sent electronically to a pharmacy, you'd receive 90% of those 10 points or 9 and so on. Your score in this category then is based on the sum of points that you collect across all these measures. So if we say that differently, the ideal scenario is for you to do as well as possible across all the measures that are included here. Now we're going to talk about each of these things tonight with the exception of this bonus option here, Query of Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. The reason we're not going to discuss that one much is, number one, it's optional. Number two, I'm not certain how many people that will apply to. The intent here is that anytime that a clinician prescribes a Schedule II medication, then they will dive into their state's prescription drug monitoring program and check that patient's opioid prescribing history. So I don't know how those prescriptive authorities vary across state lines. Beyond that, I don't know how many optometrists are actually writing prescriptions for Schedule II narcotics to actually qualify for this. So if you'd like to talk more about that optional measure here, this one that's listed as bonus, please let us know. We can have that discussion outside of this. But I think the vast majority of people on this call tonight, that Query of Prescription Drug Monitoring Program won't be something that we need to talk too much about. Now, specifically, the requirements here are that all of these measures that we're going to talk about are required over a 90-day performance period. When we say performance period, you can equate that to the reporting periods that you may remember from meaningful use. Sometimes those reporting periods were 365 days, sometimes they were 90 days. Since we've been in the merit-based incentive payment system, we haven't seen anything but a 90-day period, and that's what we're going to see for the foreseeable future. So you must achieve success for each of these measures or qualify for an exclusion where possible over a 90-day period of time. What does success mean? Well, for a numerical measure, it means that you've done it at least once. So if we go back to our example with e-prescribing, if I want to get credit for e-prescribing, I need to either qualify for an exclusion or at least one prescription that I write during my 90-day period needs to be sent electronically to a pharmacy. On the exclusion front, there's exclusions available for everything except for one measure, and that is provide patients electronic access to their health information. A lot of times you'll hear us refer to that as the Revolution PHR measure because it's really asking us to provide a username and password to Revolution PHR to our patients. Importantly, if you exclude from a measure, and we're going to go through these possibilities in just a second, Medicare does not just give you the points that would normally be associated to it. So if I qualified for an exclusion from e-prescribing, Medicare is not going to just hand me those 10 points. Instead, they're going to reassign those points to other measures. And as I said, we'll go through the various scenarios in just a second so you can get a feel for where those points go. And then finally, one thing that you won't see on here, but is still a requirement, is a security risk analysis. Many of you remember that from the days of meaningful use, or even the early days of the merit-based incentive payment system, where it actually contributed to your score in some fashion, particularly as a component of your base score. Now, if you look across these measures, you won't see it there at all because it doesn't contribute to your points. However, it is a fundamental requirement of this category. If you do not do it and do not complete it during the calendar year, even if you scored 100% on everything else, you'd receive a 0 in this category. That's how important Medicare believes it is to protect the health information that you manage in your practice. So let's talk a little bit about the exclusions. As I said, there's exclusions available for everything that's in yellow here. And the one thing that's not in yellow, that one does not offer an exclusion. So let's talk about where these points get reallocated in the event that an exclusion is claimed. Now, I don't think you need to memorize this, but you may end up coming back to this later in the year when you think about how you're going to report data, because there can be some strategy involved in certain cases where claiming an exclusion could actually lead to better scoring, even though you could have been successful. So here's an example. Let's say e-prescribing, I qualified for an exclusion. And in this last column over here, you can see what happens when those points are shifted away. So instead of it being worth 10 points, it's worth 0. And the 10 points are split evenly between the two measures of health information exchange. Okay. Now, if I excluded from sending health information, those 20 points go down to the Revolution PHR measure. And what you'll notice about that right away is that even without the exclusion, it's worth 40% of your overall score in this category. With the exclusion, it's worth 60%. So either way, that Revolution PHR measure is worth a pretty healthy share of your score in this category, making it all the more important that you're using it and you're consistent in your procedure to make sure that your patients receive access to their clinical data. Much more on that in a second. How about the receiving incorporating health information measure? If we exclude from that, those 20 points move up to the send measure. Okay, now making it worth double what it was originally at 40 points. And then finally, down at the bottom, if I exclude from public health and clinical data exchange, those points also move up to provide patients electronic access to their health information. So let's go through a not uncommon scenario. This doctor excluded from e-prescribing, so those points shift down to the two measures of health information exchange. The doctor then excludes from receiving and incorporating health information, moving all of those points now to the send measure, and then they exclude from sending. Revolution PHR measure is now worth 90% of the doctor's score in this category. Okay? You could even take that a step further. We said if the doctor excluded from the registry objectives, now 100% of their score is coming from Revolution PHR. So we title this slide, why is the PHR so important? Well, it's so important because with the way these points shift around, it's very possible that you could have the bulk or all of your score being based on how consistently your patients are receiving access, meaning username and password, to Revolution PHR so they can review their clinical data if they would like. So here's just a summary slide. We won't go through this again, but it's just describing what happens from a point shift scenario for the various measures. The hope is if you come back to these slides later, you have this all summarized in one slide. So one quick reference to look at. So again, those are the measures. Let's step through each of them. We'll go through the scoring. Where possible, we'll highlight the actions in Revolution EHR so that you're comfortable with what's going to be required. We'll start with the one that we said doesn't contribute to the actual number of points you get, and that is the Protect Patient Health Information or Security Risk Analysis measure. Some quick facts about it. We said a couple of times, it's not part of your score, but it absolutely needs to be done. What is an SRA or what is a security risk analysis? Well, in its simplest terms, it is a process whereby you're going to explore your practice for risks to the protected health information that you create in the practice, that you receive from others, that you maintain, or that you may transmit to others. You can think about it as really putting on, looking at the practice through the lens of your patient's eyes. You know, what types of things would your patients notice? Would they be able to see monitors displaying patient data? If they walk by diagnostic equipment in the practice, would they have the capabilities of logging in and seeing other patients' clinical data? Things like that. But those are the sorts of topics that need to be addressed so that you are ensuring that the patient health information or protected health information that you manage is secure. As I said, this needs to be completed at some point during the calendar year, but very importantly, it can be completed outside of your 90-day performance period if that suits your needs. So what that means is if you chose the second quarter of the year for your performance period, and by the way, it doesn't need to be confined to a calendar quarter. I'm just using that for the sake of simplicity here. And then you didn't get around to completing your security risk analysis till the fourth quarter of the year, that's absolutely fine. As long as it is marked completed by December 31st, 2020, you will have met this requirement. It also works the other way around. If you completed your SRA in the second quarter, but your promoting interoperability performance period was the third quarter, that's completely fine as well. Now, you can complete this process yourself, or you can partner with a third party. There are no requirements around that. Many will actually choose to partner with a third party because in the interest of making the exercise as useful as possible, it can be really helpful to get the voice of experience and expertise on your side. But again, no requirement to do that. If you do choose to keep the activity in-house and finish this activity yourself, we would strongly consider you use the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT's SRA tool. We can provide you with a link to that. It is an application you can install on an iPad or a laptop. It'll walk you through a series of about 125 to 150 questions that'll help you explore the risk to the data in your practice. Another benefit of that is it will produce the documentation that you would need to support yourself in the event of an audit. Now, if you choose to partner with a third party, which again, many do, because if you choose to take this on yourself, there will inevitably be questions that you're going to come across that will make you scratch your head, because let's face it, we are eye doctors, we are eye care teams, we are not security experts. So there's going to be some questions and terms that are used in some of the questions that we just won't have immediate access to what's actually being asked. So that's where a third party can be really, really helpful in this and making it simple for us. Revolution EHR has two partners in this space. So I'm not saying you need to consider you need to use these partners, but I think they deserve your consideration primarily because they've done enough security processes for our customers to be familiar with some of the security options within Revolution EHR. And what that ultimately means for you is they will ask less questions of you. They know the capabilities that the software has, and they can answer some of those questions in advance. So Abide is one of those partners. They offer a completely cloud-based process for you that'll provide you and your staff with ongoing education and all the documentation that you need. Metastar offers a partially cloud-based process with also some individualized support to help you walk through some of those more challenging questions. Again, either path that you choose, whether it's either these partners or somebody else altogether, or you choose to keep it in-house, that's absolutely fine. You just need to do what's best for your practice. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to us because we'd be happy to talk more about it. Let's move on to eprescribing. This is the first numerical measure. The intent here is obviously to increase efficiency and safety, because if we are entering prescriptions in a computer and transmitting those electronically to the pharmacy, there aren't going to be transcription errors. Plus, being in a computer system, it becomes a lot easier for drug-to-drug and drug allergy interaction checks during that prescribing process. The denominator here is going to be the number of prescriptions that you write during your performance period. Okay. And the numerator is going to be the number of those prescriptions that are ultimately sent electronically to a pharmacy. This measure is worth up to 10 points. And as we said before, your performance determines how many of those 10 points you get. Exclusion-wise, you are capable of excluding if less than 100 prescriptions that you write during your performance period, excuse me, I think I misworded that. It's possible to exclude if you write less than 100 prescriptions during your performance period. That said, and I think I have this point on the next slide, you do not need to exclude if you write less than 100 prescriptions. That is not a threshold that needs to be surpassed. So let's say you only wrote 5 prescriptions during your performance period, but you wrote all those electronically that were sent to a pharmacy electronically. You just achieved 100% performance. So it's actually a better idea for you to report success and receive full credit in this category than to claim the exclusion and have these points shifted to a potentially more difficult set of measures. Okay, so if you are using a certified e-prescribing system and you write most of your prescriptions that way, you're going to do very well, regardless of your prescribing volume. Now, Revolution EHR has an integrated e-prescribing partner, that is RxNT. Many of you are using that. Others of you have heard of it. It is not a requirement. You can use any e-prescribing solution that you'd like. RxNT offers some efficiency gains in terms of data transfer back and forth, but that is not to say it's the only way that you can accomplish this. You can use other certified e-prescribing systems, but the one thing to keep in mind is beyond the efficiency side of things, the scorecard that you're going to use to track your progress can only track those actions that are taken in RxNT. If you're going to use a non-integrated system, you'll need to produce a report from that system near the end of the performance period or the end of the year to help support you in your attestation process, whereby you would report your performance information to Medicare. Okay, so that's e-prescribing. That one's pretty straightforward. Let's start with this. Let's move on to the first measure of health information exchange here, named support electronic referral loops by sending health information. The intent here is that anytime we refer a patient out to another provider, Medicare wants us sharing electronically formatted health information to that doctor. And the reason for that is that electronic information can be presented to the recipient in electronic fashion on their screen, where they can compare the inbound document to the data they have in the patient record already and start to make decisions about what information they would like to be part of their record. Okay, there's no manual transcription at all. Ends up being a more efficient process, a more accurate process, because you're not relying on the patients to self-report information. So there is an expectation on the sending provider. So if you're sending a patient out for, say, cataract evaluation, maybe a retinal evaluation, maybe you're sending a patient to a primary care physician for diabetes workup, whatever it may be, that's the sort of outbound referral where this electronic file should be provided to the other doctor. So the denominator here is going to be the number of outbound referrals during your 90-day period. The numerator is then going to be the number of those referrals that are accompanied by that electronic summary file. The value here starts at 20 points. It could be higher than that. It could be lower than that if you claim an exclusion. The exclusion is possible if less than 100 patients are referred out during the performance period. Now, when you think about this exclusion being possible, especially on an individual basis, think about how many patients you may refer out during a 90-day period of time. I think most of us would say we do not refer 100 or more patients out during a 90-day period of time when we consider us on our individual merits. Now, maybe that isn't true if you think about adding the performance together of all the doctors in the practice, but at the individual level, most people probably qualify for this exclusion. But again, that's not to say you should claim the exclusion. It's just to keep in mind that it's very likely going to be a possibility for you. When we want to consider what is needed for success, we need to understand that the outbound referral workflow that's involved in scoring this measure all takes place in one component in Revolution EHR, and that is the referrals component. That's where you can create the referral. That's where the electronic file can be generated and sent. And that's also where you'll indicate confirmation of receipt. We put that term in bold because that may be new to some of you. The reason that is necessary is because Medicare does not specify that direct messaging is an absolute requirement. For those who don't know direct messaging or aren't familiar with it, direct messaging is a secure protocol that connects EHRs to EHRs, and thinking about it differently, connects healthcare teams to healthcare teams, allows for a secure transmission of protected health information. Now, Medicare likes that. It was part of EHR certification, but at the same time, they don't want to limit people to just that process. They're going to let people exchange information in any fashion that they'd like, by any mechanism that they'd like, as long as the process is secure. So this idea of confirmation of receipt is designed to ensure that no matter what path you choose to share that information, that they're making sure that the consulting provider is aware that you've actually sent information. So the analogy I use a lot of times is, if I send a letter to your house, it's pretty reasonable that you're going to know that I sent a letter to your house, right? You probably check your mail on a daily basis. But if someone uses a post office box, maybe they don't check their mail every day. Maybe they check every so often. Maybe they never check it. So there are post office box-like mechanisms by which doctors can share health information, especially electronic health information. Think about like a third-party portal whereby I may upload my document, I may tell the other provider that it's there, and then that provider would log in and download it to their system. Now, that is not an efficient process by any stretch of the imagination, but it's perfectly allowable under the flexibility that Medicare wants to allow. But in that scenario, if I am following a process like that, Medicare wants me to make sure that that other doctor knows that I've uploaded a file. That's all this confirmation of receipt is about. It's just making sure that we have reasonable certainty that the consulting clinician knows that we've provided the file. As I said, direct messaging based exchange is automatically tracked by the scorecard. Those of you who are customers of RevDirect, you know that those transmissions are automatically tracked on the scorecard. As I said, you can use any secure transmission process that you'd like, but just like when we talked about eprescribing, there will be a need for manually tracking those actions throughout your performance period. Very importantly, I've mentioned the term electronic document a few times. It is the electronic document that Medicare is focusing on here. I think we're all familiar with sending PDFs or sending letters through the mail, or maybe even faxing information. That will not count in your favor for this measure. Medicare wants it being electronic information that is shared back and forth. So let's take a look at the workflow here. Here I'm on the patient summary screen or patient dashboard, however you choose to refer to it. I said all the referral workflow takes place in the referrals component. I can get there two ways. If I happen to be in an encounter, I can go through show more and I'll see the referrals tab. But if I'm on the patient summary screen, I can scroll down and I'll see the referrals component down here. Selecting the referrals component takes me to this screen, right? It's a historical perspective where I can select the plus button to start a new referral. For the purposes of this demonstration, we're not going to pay attention to this response area at all. We're just going to pay attention to referral over here. I can see there are 4 fields that need to be completed. 2 of them are already completed for me. The 2 that are not. One says referred to, the other says reason. In referred to, I'm going to select the doctor that I'm sending the patient to, in this case, Dr. Anderson. And let's just say cataract evaluation, right? Preferably spelling correctly is a good idea on these. Cataract evaluation, right eye. When I select add, I'll notice that these transition of care documents buttons become active. Generate is how I would create a paper-based document. As I said, for the purpose of this measure, we don't really care about that. It's also how I'd create an electronic document to be used outside of Revolution EHR, but again, we're covering the automatically tracked process here. And to do that, the button that we want to pay attention to is the send button. Now, this send button will only be active when both the referred by provider and the referred to provider have direct addresses logged in their employee profiles in Revolution EHR. Both of these providers can say that that is true. So when I select send, I'll get a new message window. It looks very much like any other message that I would send, whether internal or external. So here's the patient we discussed. And you'll notice that I can attach any file that I would like. So whether I'd like that to be an OCT or visual field, a letter, what have you, it can all be attached. When I select send, what's going to happen is Revolution EHR is going to process this message. And what you'll notice is there's automatically an attachment. That is the electronic file that's required by this measure. So Revolution EHR creates that file, it builds in the appropriate information, and then it sends it securely to Dr. Anderson's direct messaging system. Importantly, that does not need to be a Revolution EHR account. It can be any direct messaging system that's out there, and there are lots of them. But again, remember, the direct is designed to be a connection between EHRs and EHR systems. So when that transmission is complete, it takes me back to this referral screen where I can get a historical perspective of how I've managed this patient in the past. I can see that on February 20th of 2020, I sent this patient to Dr. Anderson for cataract evaluation of the right eye. So you can see how it may be helpful over time to get a historical perspective of how you manage the patient. So I know I've triggered the denominator because I created a referral. I know I've done one of the 2 numerator actions, right? I sent an electronic document to the consulting provider, but I haven't indicated confirmation of receipt yet. So to do that, I would open the referral back up, and down at the bottom, you'll see confirmation of receipt. When I select yes and save, that is how the numerator will trigger for me. Now, one point I'll make is don't try to do the actions here in opposite order. Don't try to indicate confirmation of receipt before sending. That is obviously the opposite order of events, and you will not see that counting in your favor. You need to send the information before indicating confirmation of receipt. So that's how support electronic referral loops by sending health information is scored. Let's move on to the complementary measure of that, and it's known as receiving and incorporating health information. By the way, I just remembered something that I did not introduce on the introductory slide. I did not introduce that Marnie Anderson is here. She is our quality reporting manager. She will probably be, and she probably has been throughout this, and I apologize, Marnie, for not mentioning this in the beginning. She's answering questions throughout tonight's presentation. So if anybody has any questions about anything that I say that could be confusing, please feel free to type those in. She'd be more than happy to answer them. She'll mention some of those out loud later on, and any that we happen to gloss over, we'll answer by email afterwards. So as I mentioned, receive and incorporates the complement to the send measure, because once we receive electronic health information from another provider, we're capable of comparing that information live on the screen to the information that may be in the patient record. And that puts us in a really powerful position to take advantage of some efficiency gains by dropping medications directly into the patient record. I'm going to show you that process here. The denominator here is going to be the sum of inbound referrals you see plus, and this part's very important, encounters with patients that you've never seen before. Okay, so the number of those types of visits that take place during the performance period make up the denominator. The numerator is then going to be the number of those encounters, okay, the number of those referrals or new patient encounters where you receive an electronic file and then you use it to electronically reconcile three categories: the patient's problem list, patient's medication list, and their medication allergy list. The value here starts at 20 points, could be more, could be less, okay, based on the exclusion possibility. And speaking of that, the exclusion is possible if the sum of inbound referrals plus new patient encounters is less than 100. So unlike the send measure, where we said the exclusion is very likely to be possible, this one is a whole lot less likely. When we think about inbound referrals, the chances of us seeing less than 100 is certainly true for most practices. But when you think about new patient encounters, there's a very good chance that you're going to see more than 90 new patients during more than 100 new patients during a 90-day performance period, especially if your practice is in growth phase. If you have a lot of openings on your schedule, it's a good chance that a lot of those availabilities are going to be filled up by new patients, and those new patients fall into the denominator automatically. So if you happen to look at your scorecard during this presentation or after it, just to see how you're doing on various things, you may look at this one and see a lot bigger denominator than you'd expect. That is because new patients are automatically included in the measure. Now, some key points. An electronic file is required, just like we talked about on the send side. We need that electronic file to follow the process we're going to be talking about in just a second. It does require you to electronically process or reconcile that file. I'll show you exactly what that means here in just a second. In the event that you are unable to obtain an electronic document, you can actually remove that incident or that encounter from consideration, right? There has to be some flexibility for that. Take, for example, a scenario where the sending provider is using paper records. They're not going to be able to provide you with an electronic document to use for the process I'm going to show you. So Medicare needed to provide some flexibility for that patient to be removed. And the way that we will do that is through actions that we'll take on the reason for visit screen, and I will highlight those in just a second. Very importantly, the actions that I'm going to show you don't need to be completed prior to the encounter signature. And what I'm really trying to say there is you don't need to do all this right at the time of the visit. It stands to reason that in some scenarios, you may receive that electronic file ahead of a patient encounter, like when a patient may be referred to you and you may not see them for a couple weeks. Similarly, in the case of a new patient where you reach out to the primary care physician for a copy of the last exam in electronic format, you may not get that information for a couple weeks after the fact. That should not hold up your signing of the encounter or your completion of the encounter, and it doesn't. You can take the actions that I'm about to show you at any point during the calendar year, and it will count in your favor. And probably most importantly, you don't need to unsign the encounter to complete these actions. So let's look at it. Let's jump into our demo patient here. We have Myra Banks here, who we can see is a brand new patient because they have that indication right in the header. We can also see that there's no exam history. The patient has no medications. If I was to show you the allergy list, we'd see no allergies there. I would also like to jump into the scorecard for a second, just to show you where we are. For those who don't know where the scorecard is, that would be reports, administration, providers, and at the very bottom of the list, the scorecard that you will use to track your performance in the promoting interoperability category in 2020 MIPS PI stage 3. When I load that scorecard, I can see each of the measures that we're talking about tonight. If I was unfamiliar with how anything was scored, for example, if I saw 0 for 2 for send health information and I had no idea why, I could click the name of the measure. It will take me to Revolution EHR's knowledge base, where it will see a text-based discussion of the measure. We'll see some screenshots, and then we will also see a very quick video clip of the actions that are required to trigger the measure. So always keep that in mind, that you have that resource available to you. If you ever wanted to see who those 2 patients were, you could select audit. It'll produce a text file for you, and it'll show you the names of the patients that are in the numerator and the denominator and the medical record number associated to those patients. But the reason I really wanted to show you this is because you can see the receive and incorporate health information measure here is O for O. So the actions that I'm going to be taking in this demonstration are what triggers the denominator and numerator. So let's jump back into our patient here. As we said, brand new patient. We said there are 2 types of patient encounters that are considered: brand new patient, and then those patients that are referred in. So we're going to take scenario 1 here first. We're going to consider a new patient. Let's say that patient just found us on the internet. They wanted to come in, just get their eyes checked, regular comprehensive exam. So nobody referred the patient. The first thing that I need to consider is I need to go to the history screen, because I mentioned on our quick facts slide that there are a couple of indications here to consider. The first is transition of care. The second is ETOC document. ETOC document is how I'd remove a patient from consideration when I'm unable to obtain an electronic document. Okay, that is not the scenario we're going to replicate right here. Transition of care is how I would indicate that this patient has been referred in to see me. Well, we said that isn't the case here. We said this is just a brand new patient that chose to come see us on their own volition. Patient was not referred at all. So I don't need to check anything. I don't need to do anything on this screen. Let's also assume that during the check-in process that the front office staff said, would it be okay if we reach out to the primary care physician to get an electronic list of your medications and diagnosis history, just so we can take better care of your eyes? Patient says yes, maybe they sign a form. That's sent off to the consulting provider. Okay, as I said earlier, maybe we don't expect to get that information at the time of this encounter. Let's then say I go about my encounter, I document all the things I would normally encounter, document it through the course of an encounter. Let's then say I code it as 92004. Normally I'd associate an ICD-10 to that because I probably want to be paid for this. And then let's say I sign it. Patient then leaves, right? They leave the office, they leave the practice. And let's say 2 weeks later, we receive a direct message. That direct message, if someone is using RevDirect, it is integrated directly into the messages module in Revolution EHR. So I can see I have a message waiting for me. If I select that message and I open it, I'll see that there's an attachment. I can see there's a message that says, here's the information you requested. TOC from Myra Banks. I can see that is a .xml file. That designation at the end lets me know that it's the electronic format that I need for this process. Next to that is an icon that'll allow me to save that file to Myra Banks patient record. So when I select it, and by the way, this save button doesn't need to be used just for this type of process. If you received information from let's say you received a fundus photo or a letter from another provider, that all can be saved to the patient record through that icon that I just used. But in this case, I'm going to select the patient that I'd like to save the file to. I can add a description here that I'd like, just for the purposes of our demonstration. I am just going to put something meaningless there. I'll select save, and what happens in that case is that attachment gets saved to the documents and images folder of the selected patient. More specifically, gets saved to the transferred messages files folder. Okay. Now I see that file sitting here. What I want to do really quick is jump back to the scorecard to demonstrate that the numerator is 0, the denominator is 1. Right? I've seen a brand new patient, so the patient appears in the denominator, but I have not built electronic information in. I've not electronically reconciled it yet, so I'm still a 0 numerator. Jump back into the patient record. We have that file sitting there. When I select it, I'll notice there's some options over here to the right. When I select incorporate, Revolution EHR is going to process the information in that file for me and present it to me in a couple different fashions. One of those, I have the ability to view the document. The other, I have the ability to continue to a side-by-side electronic reconciliation process. Now, this continue button is the one that we want to select when we're considering MIPS credit. But I always like to consider how this stuff could also be as useful as possible to you clinically. And for that, you need to consider this view document option, because when you choose to view this document, you get a lot more information. You'll see all the different sections that are at your availability here, like allergies and adverse reactions, historical encounter listing. You'll see the other provider's treatment plan. You'll see the problem list. So lots of really good information in here that maybe you would wonder about a patient. That could even make things like coding your encounters easier. Very important, again, that information all comes from the other clinician's EHR. So it's all provider validated information. But again, for the purposes of scoring, we want to continue. From there, Revolution is going to present me the inbound document on the left, or at least the information within it, side by side with the information that's in our record. Now, we said this is a brand new patient, so we don't expect anything to appear here over on the right. So seeing this as blank is exactly the way we would expect it to be. From there, I can make decisions about what diagnoses I want to be part of the patient's record in my system. So for example here, severe hypothyroidism, maybe I'd like to keep that. Maybe I'd like to keep essential hypertension, but fever, no, I don't think I want that. So I'm going to select fever and I'm going to remove it. Chronic rejection of renal transplant, maybe I don't want that one either. I'm going to remove it. Overweight, I can see that that one's inactive. So even if it was active, I don't know if I would want it, but because it's inactive, I definitely don't want it. I'm going to remove it. From there, when I select consolidate, what the system is going to do is merge these two sides into one master diagnosis list for me. Okay. I can then move on to medication prescription. I can do the same sort of decision-making process. Here I can see that there are two medications that have been discontinued. I'm going to remove those and then merge to create one master medication list. Drug allergies, same idea. Two active medication allergies, I'd like those to be part of my record, consolidate. When I've done that for all three categories, I'll select continue. And then when I select confirm on this screen, this is what will trigger the numerator for the receive and incorporate measure. Okay. Revolution will confirm for me that the information has been built into the patient record. When I open the patient record back up, I'll see that now those diagnoses have been built in. If I head into medications, that medication's been added. And if I jump to allergies, we'll see those two allergies have been added. And very important, those all have been added through the clicks of a button rather than me needing to type things in. And perhaps even more importantly, it's based on, again, the information from the other provider's record. It's not me asking a patient what you're taking and having them not be absolutely certain about it. If I head to the scorecard, I am now 1 for 1. Okay, saw a new patient, received an electronic file, and electronically incorporated that information. Now, I did say there are two scenarios, right? One was a new patient, the second was a inbound referral. So let's simulate that. Let's take this patient again. Let's say the scenario here is the patient went to the emergency room for a red eye. The emergency room said, we don't know how to deal with that. We're going to send you to Dr. So-and-so to be evaluated. So the patient is being referred in. I would start whatever sort of template I would normally use for that. But one of the key differences right off the bat is I need to consider this RFE screen again, these two indications. Because the patient is being referred in, I want to indicate transition of care. Remember, if the patient wasn't being referred in, I do not want to use this box. We've seen a number of cases where people have associated this transition of care button to something from the past, and they just select it every single encounter that they provide. And what that does is it artificially inflates the denominator, and we don't want to do that. So only use this button in the event of an inbound referral. From there, let's do one other thing. Actually, let me go back to the scorecard, and I'll show you that I'm now 1 for 2. Okay, this patient's being counted again because they are now being seen as an inbound referral. But let's say the scenario here is that the emergency room, our staff reached out and said, thank you for sending the patient. We just need an electronic file to help us build our record. The ER says, well, we're using paper records. We don't have the ability to send you an electronic document. So in that scenario, I can consider this ETOC document field. If I use the drop down here, I'll see an indication or a value labeled requested but unavailable. When I select that and then I move on to the next screen, if I head back to the scorecard, I'll now see that I'm 1 for 1. Okay, that 2 in the denominator has been decreased by 1 because I've now told the system that I just don't have the ability to get an electronic file on that inbound referral. Okay, so as I said before, that process that I just showed you can be done anytime during the calendar year, and it can be done even if the encounter had been signed already. Okay, so don't feel like you need to hold up the process of signing your encounters and completing that sort of workflow just because you're waiting on this measure. That stuff can be completed at any point during your during the calendar year. All right, I expect there are going to be some questions about that, so feel free to submit those. We can talk about them later or even outside of the presentation. The last numerical measure is provide patients electronic access to their health information. We've called this one Revolution PHR measure a number of times. The intent here is to empower patients with their information, because if they have access to their health information, the thinking is that they'll be more engaged with their care. The more engaged in care they are, the better the outcomes ultimately are. The denominator is going to be the number of unique patients that you see during your performance period. What's a unique patient? Well, it means that if you've seen a patient, say 4 or 5 times, that they will only be counted once in the denominator. Numerator-wise is going to be the number of those patients in the denominator where the following 2 things were true for all encounters during their performance period. The patient has a username and password for Revolution PHR. And what I'm not saying there is you need to create a new username and password at every single encounter. Simply saying that those need to be present for each encounter during the performance period. Or say that differently, it has to be present at the first. Okay, and then the encounter is signed within 4 business days. The value here, as we talked about before, starts at a minimum of 40 points, could be as much as 100 points, or your full score in this performance category based on exclusions shifting around. And there is absolutely not an exclusion available here. So if you intend to participate in this performance category, and maybe you haven't looked at the PHR before, considered how you'd implement that in your practice, now is the time to do it, because you will absolutely need at least one patient to have access to their clinical data to get any sort of score on this measure, and in turn any sort of score in the promoting interoperability performance category. Very importantly, and this should make many of you that are just coming back from maybe stage 2 meaningful use back in 2014, you are not measured on patient utilization. Something that caused us nightmares a number of years ago was something called VDT actual use. And it may actually still be causing some nightmares for people in the Medicaid incentive program. But it is something that is gone, right, in the merit-based incentive payment system. It is not something that you are graded on. You are not encouraged. Let me start that statement over and say that you are not measured on patients actually using the username and password that you give them. Okay, so another way of saying this is you are completely in control of your performance here. Make sure your patients are given a username and password for Revolution PHR at that first visit, and then after that, the key will simply be making sure that your encounters are signed within 4 business days, because once the username and password are set for a given patient, they're set forevermore, right? Every subsequent visit then just becomes a matter of signing the encounters within 4 business days. Very importantly, all visits during the performance period are considered. So if you see that patient 5 times and that first visit was not successful, even if all 4 others were, the patient will count against you. All visits during the performance period need to be considered. So where does this take place in Revolution EHR? Well, it takes place in the demographics component. Many of you know there's a couple different places you can get that. One, if you happen to be with an encounter, demographics happens to be a screen within the check-in step, but I'm gonna work outside of an encounter here. Right off the bat too, note that you can tell if a patient has PHR credentials. Right up here in the header, you can see PHR no, or if I happen to be within an encounter, I can hover right on the patient name, and in that little window that opens up, I'll also have the ability to see PHR login no. There's also areas where you can see that on the schedule. Many of you know that already. But if I head into demographics, and I'll notice that there are a number of sliders here. When we get into the HTML version of demographics, these sliders will be replaced by tabs, making it a whole lot easier for you to access these various areas. But in login information, this is where we'll see where we have the ability to create these credentials. To do that, I'd select Edit. I allow login, and both of these fields now become active. Username, the important thing here is that it's unique across the Revolution EHR database. So whatever process you choose to use, it just needs to be something that's going to generate unique credentials for a patient. So I wouldn't want to use patient first name and last name, because if I did that and I had a patient named Joe Smith, there's a very good chance that somebody else in the system has the username of Joe Smith. So what a lot of people will do is actually use an email address for the patient, because that is guaranteed to be unique in most cases for a patient. Now, I know there are families out there that'll share an email address across the family, but one con of using an email address is that a lot of times patients won't provide you with an email address. Maybe they don't use email, maybe they just don't want you to have their email address. So a different process some practices will use is they will use, they'll create a standard username format for their practice. So in this example, let's just say first name, last name, and then birth year. Okay, and that becomes something that's really easy to convey, whether in text form or verbally to a patient. right? We're telling what their username is. I then select check username. It'll check against the Revolution EHR database to make sure it's unique. It says it is available. So I can now move on to generating a temporary password for the patient. I can do that randomly by clicking this button a number of times. You'll see that it's a mixed case bunch of characters. And the challenge with mixed case letters is, yes, it's more secure, but the challenge is conveying those. You'll write these things down, and sometimes it can be hard to tell if it's an uppercase or lowercase, and that can create confusion for the patient. So again, something else that practices will choose to do here to create a temporary password is maybe stringing three short words together, maybe a color, and a fruit, and then maybe an animal, right? Just some sort of standard process that they use whereby they're dispensing a temporary password to the patient that, remember, that the patient's going to change the first time they log into Revolution PHR. Again, the advantage of this, real easy to write out, real easy for the patient to understand what what these words are, and real easy for them to get started in terms of entering that information into Revolution EHR. Revolution PHR. When I select update, that information is saved to the patient record, and then all these indications of where we checked for PHR, yes or no, will now be indicating yes for me. Okay. So that is how you create credentials. Once those are built for a given patient, it simply becomes a matter of signing the encounter in a timely fashion. That is defined as within 4 business days. What that means is if you see a patient on Monday, you have till midnight, actually 11:59 p.m. on Thursday to get that encounter signed. So if you're hearing this information right now and you're part of the eye care team at your practice and you recognize that this may create some challenges for some doctors in the practice, now would be a good time to have discussions with them about how important it is that they sign their records in timely fashion. The last measure here, public health and clinical data registry reporting. The goal here is obviously have us engaging with registries, because registries offer us a unique perspective into the conditions that we manage and how we're managing them. You're expected to do what's called actively engage with 2 registries. The value here is 10 points. You get those 10 points if you engage with 2 registries, or if you engage with 1 and qualify for exclusions from everything else. There are 3 different types of exclusions available for each type of data registry. We're not going to go dive into those tonight. You can find those exclusions spelled out clearly in the knowledge base that you can link to from the scorecard we showed you earlier. Many of you may be registered with AOA More. AOA More, that is the Measures and Outcomes Registry for Eye Care. It is a clinical data registry down here at the bottom for the purposes of MIPS. Now, with that in mind, what does actively engaged mean? Well, actively engaged or active engagement means that the clinician is moving towards the submission of real patient data. That can be demonstrated any of 3 ways. Number 1 is you completed registration no later than 60 days after the start of your performance period. What that means is for any of you who have registered with AOA More in earlier years, you are entitled to the points that MIPS would offer you for active engagement, because you have done what number 1 asks of you, and it'll count in your favor, right? You are actively engaged with that registry. There's no requirement that you be utilizing live patient data. Number 2, testing and validation of data submission. And then number 3, actively submitting patient data. Any of those 3 qualify as active engagement. So that is what public health and clinical data registry reporting is all about. Those are the measures. Some miscellaneous or MIPScellaneous points as it may be in closing. 90-day performance period in this category again. Remember, you have to do a security risk analysis if you want to score in this category, but that process can be completed at any point during the years as long as it's done by December 31st. You must achieve success for each measure or qualify for an exclusion. You can monitor your performance on the MIPS PI Stage 3 scorecard that we've illustrated a couple times. Once you've completed your 90-day period, and once the year ends, you will have a 3-month window whereby you will report that data to Medicare. So that gives you till March 31st of the year 2021 to report your data for 2020. And you can report that data as a group or individual. Very importantly, when you report as an individual, you're evaluated on your own merits. When you report as a group, you're pooling the data together of all the doctors in the practice and reporting at one time. That decision must remain consistent across all performance categories. You do not have the ability to report as an individual for this category and as a group for others. Remember, there's a lot of resources available for you to study this stuff beyond these webinars that we will hold periodically throughout the year. We talked about the knowledge base. We're going to find recorded video segments and discussions of the measures. There's Ask About MU and MIPS, where you can send a question to our quality reporting team. And then there's a Quest for Excellence community on Facebook, where it's closed just to Revolution EHR customers to share their questions and answers about how they've made these things happen in practice. We also have a strong community of people within RevAspire. That is a partnership service that arms to support you as much as possible, to take as much of the responsibility away from your practice as possible, so that you can focus on the things that you would really like to be focusing on. RevAspire offers a number of different things, but it's delivered through 3 arms. One is score optimization. If we talk about that score controlling your reimbursements, we want to make sure that that score is accurately reflecting how awesome you're doing for your patients. A lot of times we'll see the doctor's taking great care of patients, but it's not being represented statistically, right? So RevAspire is going to bridge that gap for you. Data submission, once we have that data optimized, that data will be submitted on your behalf by the RevAspire team, which means you do not need to worry about that process of data collection and analysis and any of that stuff anymore. RevAspire is going to do it for you. And then finally, they would protect you in the event of an audit. If an audit ever came your way, you'd let our team know. They would send you back to see your patients, and we would have your audit response turned around by noon the next day. Happy to say 100% successful. No RevAspire doctors ever needed to return money to the government. So I hope that information is helpful. I know it's a lot of information. This will be available in recorded fashion, so you can come back to it. Hopefully you've asked some questions. If I said some confusing things, which I'm sure I probably did, hopefully Marnie has answered those. She'll bring some of those forward here in the time we have remaining. But also feel free to send questions directly to me if you feel that I have sent you astray in anything that I've said. So Marnie, what have you guys been talking about through the questions?
Well, as you can imagine, this receive and incorporate health information has brought up a lot of questions, and there's the same questions that we've been dealing with the last so many years about, I don't have anybody who's out there in terms of what we might call trading partners who's able to do anything other than fax us something or send us a document that's not in a true electronic health information format. So we've been just covering why that'll be important to keep asking, see if maybe over the course of the year there might be others out there that are capable of doing this, but then, take advantage of that audit option to identify the list of new patients, incoming referrals for the denominator for that measure, and then updating that ETOC document as appropriate so that they don't count against you. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of them coming in. There was another question along this line. So is the expectation, actually I'm going to back up because I think he asked a good question in the first round. The question was how and why are brand new patients considered, part of that denominator for what we think of as incoming referrals. And I think the better way to think of it is transitions of care, regardless of how they're coming to you. The goal is to build a valid record for that patient. So someone walking in because they found you on Yelp or were referred by someone else, not necessarily coming from another provider, you still want to get the most accurate current information. So it's a transition of care, maybe is a better way to think of it than a straight referral. I don't know if you wanted to add something about that.
No, I think that's a great way to explain it and look at it. And the only other thing that I would add is just a little bit of color on the idea of provider validated information. Even going back to medication reconciliation, the days of meaningful use, the intent was for us to get away from relying on patients giving us information. And now you're just seeing that supercharged here through this electronic process. So yeah, I think you explained it very well, Marnie.
Okay, I think that was the flavor of the comments for that one. Yeah, and then I would just point out you can always reach out to us after this, especially if you have a specific scenario or just want to run through it through Ask About MU and MIPS or to the quality reporting email. We'd be happy to break it down for you.
Okay. So in closing, you will probably get an email tomorrow or in the coming days, just letting you know where the recording for this lies. As part of that, there will be an offer for a MIPS consult. That was a process we offered last year, whereby you could actually utilize Marnie's expertise and talk about the various resources that you have available to you, learn a little bit about your practice eligibility, and talk through the options that you have there. So be on the lookout for that if that sounds of something of interest to you. There's also a handout available if the idea of a RevAspire partnership interests you at all, or you want to learn more about it. I know our team would be very happy to talk to you and learn more about your practice. So that handout can provide you some additional information. But any questions anytime, as Marnie said, please let me know, or feel free to use that Ask About MU and MIPS link within the application. So with that, thank you very much for your attention tonight and your time. Hopefully you have a great rest of your evening, and we'll talk again very soon. Good night.